Hello, welcome to this webinar on reusing data for dissertation projects. My name is Maureen Haker, and I've worked with the UK Data Service for about 8 years, doing everything from digitizing data to reuse projects. And I'm here with Ellie Bloom, who is a research associate at University of Manchester. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to go over what secondary analysis is, look a bit closer at some of those key methodological issues of reuse projects for qualitative and for quantitative data. But before we get knee deep in that, I want to give a very brief overview of the UK Data Service for those of you who have not had the pleasure of exploring the archive yet. I've tried to pull in some case studies throughout so you can see some of our data in action, and we'll end by signposting you to some further resources which can help if you're planning a reuse project. This is an introductory workshop, so we've assumed most of you will probably have not used archives before and may have only had some introductory modules on research methods more generally. And before we get too far along, I just want to address a simple point first. What is secondary analysis? In short, secondary analysis is a method which asks new questions of old data. It's analyzing data that you've not collected yourself. Usually researchers collect far more data than they actually need to answer their own research questions. So think of national surveys, which collect a lot of data on a representative sample, or qualitative studies, which will contain interviews that could last for 1 or 2 hours or sometimes more. These data sets have lots of information, can answer a lot of different questions, and can be analyzed using different techniques. So secondary analysis makes use of that and does just that. It reuses data that's been collected by someone else. But there is a complicated nuance here. You may have heard some other terms used to describe this method, including secondary data analysis or reuse projects. And they all refer to the exact same method, so don't get too confused by this. But there is an ongoing debate about how to call this method. So in 2007, Libby Bishop wrote about the primary-secondary dualism, and she basically was making the argument that there may be a privileging of methods where you go out and collect the data yourself, and using terms like secondary analysis or secondary data reinforces that hierarchy. But actually, primary and secondary analysis are a lot more similar than different if you fully consider the key methodological issues of secondary analysis as a method. Consequently, you'll find an increase of the use of the term data reuse. And that's a term that we'll be using throughout the workshop too. And that takes into account the huge range of ways that data can be used and reused. And it doesn't imply that any of those projects are secondary to the initial use of data. You can use whatever term comes to mind first, but just do be aware that there's a few different ways of describing this process of reusing data. So now you know what secondary analysis is, but where would you find data that's already been collected? This is where the UK Data Service, which holds the largest collection of social science data in the UK, comes in. We are a comprehensive resource that is funded by the ESRC, and our main job is to be a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. The main purpose then is really the collection, the ingest, and the processing of data, and then further dissemination of that data for people to use. In addition to that data infrastructure core, we also have a service layer which provides extensive support, training, and guidance. Who is it for? We like to think that it's for anyone who has an interest in data. Traditionally, our main audience and the people who probably both deposit and use our data the most tend to be academic researchers and students like yourselves. A lot of other groups are well represented as well. This could include government analysts, charities, foundations, businesses, research centers, think tanks, all give us and use our data. Given the importance of data and how it's used and how it's disseminated, we try to reach out and support a wide range of communities. What kind of data do we hold? I know some of this language on this slide might be a bit specific, but it's just to say that the majority of our data, at least judging by the number of collections, is quantitative data. So we hold over 8,000 collections, of which 6,600 of them are quantitative collections. And that includes the survey microdata, aggregate statistics, international macro data, census data, microdata. And we do also have a fairly large collection of qualitative and mixed methods data as well. Where does it come from? That varies depending on the data type, and some of the sources that you see here, which will include agencies and statistical time series, those are our main sources of quantitative data. Most of our qualitative and mixed method data comes through individual academics, so these might actually be some of your tutors. When they get a research grant, they may well have deposited the data at the end of that grant with us. And we, of course, hold some originally paper-based public records and historical sources, including things like the census. Where can you find information about it? Well, we've got a website, ukdataservice.ac.uk, and that holds a lot of information. And from there, you can find our data catalog, and we have hundreds of pages which also discuss methodological issues like gaining consent, anonymizing data, storing data. There's also some student-specific tutorials like our data skills modules. We've got some exercises based on collections that we hold. And there's a help page if you have specific questions about how to use our website. Okay, but getting back to dissertation projects. What kind of research projects can you do from reusing data in an archive? Well, we really need to go back to the beginning to answer this and think about the research process. And you're hopefully familiar with this model. It starts out with some kind of, topic or general direction for research. You then do some background research into the literature that's already been written on your topic. From there, hopefully you're inspired to ask a question, which builds on that body of research. And once you've got that research question, you then decide the best way to answer it and design your project. Once you've settled on your method, you then collect the data, you analyze it, and you begin your write-up, which is what you would submit for your dissertation. Now, you might have a few extra steps, or you might swap around a couple of those steps depending on your theoretical foundation. But generally speaking, this is how we normally think about the research process. When you're doing a project using secondary analysis, however, this process looks different. This model that you're looking at clearly shows how the research question is built from your chosen topic area, your preliminary search, possibly the literature you find. However, with a secondary analysis project, the research question is derived directly from the data. So you start with a topic you're interested in, but instead of looking for literature, you look for data and start evaluating collections. When you find a collection that intrigues you, you then ask a question, a research question of that data. And from there, you would then find what literature exists on that question. You then would not need to collect data, you just need to access it, which is of course one of the key advantages of secondary analysis. The data is already collected. You just need to get your hands on it, either by downloading it from a catalog page, or you may need to actually go into the archive if it's only available in paper form. Once you have it, you then analyze it and write up your dissertation. So the key point I'm making here around reusing data for dissertation projects is about where your research question comes from. It would take a lot of time and inside knowledge about data within archives to be able to just come up with a research question and then search for the perfect data to answer it. You might be searching for the right data for a very long time, unless, as I said before, you actually already have a good existing knowledge about the collections. For a dissertation project, when your time and resources are limited, you'll want to look at the data first, and then from there develop a research question which gives a new take on that data. You can, of course, do it the other way around and spend some time looking for the right data. But for a dissertation project, you may want to actually look and see what data exists first in your general topic area before actually nailing down what your research question is. With that being said, it's probably important to have some kind of idea about the kind of project you want to do. While you might be exploring data without a specific question in mind, you may want to give some thought as to the kind of research design your project will follow. So there's 4 different types of reuse projects that can lend themselves well to dissertation projects. And these are reanalysis, a replication study, a comparative study, or a re-study. Reanalysis is probably the one that comes to mind when thinking about what secondary analysis is. And this involves thinking about the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. It usually means asking some kind of slightly different research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. The original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research. So these were interviews that were meant to explore how diagnoses were made. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in the analysis of the discussions between patients and doctors rather than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that kind of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat was looking at gerontology as a topic, and she found 2 different data sets which look specifically at gerontology. However, Bornat's research question was on racism, which wasn't the focus of the original work, but the data set was rich enough to allow her to explore that theme within the existing data. If you want to use the exact same analysis strategy, that would be a replication study. Right now, there's a real concern about reproducibility of research, and replication studies can reveal the messiness that's involved in working through data. So one of the most famous, or perhaps really infamous, examples of replication is from Thomas Herndon, who was a postgraduate student at University of Massachusetts. And he was assigned an assessment to replicate results from a published study. It's a fairly common exercise if you're studying quantitative methods. So he chose Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 paper, Growth in the Time of Debt. And basically, this paper came up with the proportion at which your national debt can be of your GDP before you see negative economic growth. So Thomas Herndon pulled the OECD data, so that it was using this sort of international data. So he just pulled the same data set to rerun their analysis as the paper had laid out. But he got a completely different answer. The paper said that debt cannot exceed 90% of GDP. However, he calculated that the debt can actually exceed your GDP, and even then you only see a minimum impact on growth. After contacting the original investigators, getting the actual data set that they had worked from, and not just the downloaded data set, he found that there was actually a flaw where they had miscopied some cells. The full story is published in 2013 in the New Yorker if you're interested in reading some of those details. A replication study hopefully wouldn't always find flaws in this kind of way as the original study, but nonetheless, this is a study design that's worth considering and can help you develop an appreciation for the research process. And you can even develop a project whereby you rerun a series of studies on the same topic, or perhaps you explore a complicated data set with missing data, transforming variables, and so on. You can also do comparative work, so you might be looking at an international comparison between 2 countries, or comparing social subgroups of the population based on shared social characteristics. Our key data page for quantitative data sets outlines some of the large national surveys that are held at the archive, any of which would allow you to do some comparative work, without having to actually collect two sets of data. So you could compare samples across time, geographic place, gender, ethnicity. These characteristics are usually collected as standard for these larger surveys. And the final type of reuse, I'm going to exemplify with a case study that I'm going to walk through with you. And this is a re-study, and this is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So it does a bit of secondary analysis, but it also allows you scope to actually go out and collect some data too. So this kind of reuse project is from the collection School Leavers Study. The original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. And as part of that project, Paul asked teachers to set a particular type of essay just before students were due to leave school, prompting them to imagine they were reaching the end of their life and something made them think back to the time they left school. They were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. In 2009, Graham Crow and Dawn Lyon, and that is Graham Crow on the left there with Ray Paul on the right, decided to reanalyze that data set, focusing solely on student aspirations. And using the very same methodology, they conducted a re-study of school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009. And the prompt supplied to students in 2009 was nearly the same. Imagine you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes from that set of essays to the set of essays that were collected by Ray Paul in the late 70s. And you can see the wording of the prompt in a small snippet of one essay here. And the findings are fascinating. And they show the difference of young people's aspirations after one generation, 40 years of time has passed. But how exactly were they different? In 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and it followed on from hard work. And sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or even death. And you can see a few examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one on the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2009-2010, however, showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs, filled with choice, but also a lot of uncertainty. Crow and his research team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So for example, you have the quote on the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." This study is a larger one than what might be realistic for a dissertation project, but the goal was to engage the community alongside the research and find innovative ways of including participants in the research outputs. And as part of this initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which helps to create a shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means among the community. So this is quite an ambitious project for a dissertation, but it's a good example of how you can combine a bit of data collection and a bit of data reuse into one project. And certainly for those who might be doing PhD work in future, this is something that you might actually want to consider for one of your projects. And for others, you can design a more feasible study with a smaller sample and smaller outputs. So hopefully you are now budding with ideas on what you might want to look for in the archives, or what kind of projects that you might want to do reusing data. And since you're not collecting data yourself, you'll find that reuse projects have very few ethical considerations comparatively. And hopefully you wouldn't hit too many snags with ethical review boards. However, this doesn't mean that there aren't any ethical considerations. So there's two key points that I want to make before diving into qualitative and quantitative data. So first of these starts at the point of access. How do you get permission to use the data? So if you're reusing data that's in an established archive like the UK Data Service, we've taken a lot of pain out of access by negotiating licensing issues with the person who collected the data. So this means that you have to sign what's called our end user license. And this is a really exciting legal document, which you can see on the left there. And it lists just these terms of conditions, things that you need to do or that you need to consider when you're reusing the data. And there's two really important things that I want to stress here. The first of these is that there's no onward sharing of data, and that includes with your supervisor. So if you need help with your analysis and your supervisor needs to see the data, then he or she will need to register and download the data for themselves. The end user license stipulates that you cannot, under any circumstance, share your data or your login details with anyone. All of the data that we have has been anonymized, which is, again, likely to be the case if you're reusing data from an archive. However, just because it's anonymized doesn't mean that it's completely impossible to figure out identities of participants. Mark Elliott has some really excellent YouTube tutorials which go through anonymization theory. But in short, he makes the argument that no anonymization strategy will be 100% effective at all times. Consequently, should you inadvertently uncover identities of any of the participants, then this end user license says that you will not reveal that identity to anyone. So those are the key issues to recognize when signing the end user license. So the second point I want to make, once you have sorted out the excess, you then need to ensure you cite the data. So in short, citing archive data helps data creators track the impact of their study. It also supports reproducibility, and it makes it easier to find the data that you used for your project. And the issue is so important that the UK Data Service has a page on our website which goes into a little bit more detail about data citation and will help you explain why this is an important ethical issue. With the UK Data Service, we make this easy again by supplying you with the citation that you need on our catalog pages. This citation you'll see underneath the box citation and copyright on our catalog page, and then you just need to select what kind of citation format you want, and you can just copy and paste that citation into your reference list. So you've got access, you've sorted out citation, now comes actually doing the secondary analysis. So first, I'll walk you through qualitative data and a couple of key issues with getting started with qual data, and then I'll pass over to Ali, who's going to talk about quantitative data. So first, I'll talk about reorienting yourself to the collection, recontextualizing that data, and finally, just a couple of points about sampling. So when you first download a data set, you'll get a zipped folder which looks a bit like this. You've got some folders that are stuffed with files. And most qualitative data is held in the folder called RTF. RTF is a type of Word document. So to get to the data, you just need to go into the RTF folder. And this folder, when you open it, will look like this. Ta-da! There's all your data, nicely organized. And clicking on one of those files would open up something that looks maybe something like this. And this is a snippet of the school leavers essays, what it would look like more in its entirety. And that collection contains over 100 of those files. But the files don't have to just be essays or interview transcripts. You might have, for example, PDFs of handwritten notes like in the upper left-hand corner, or you might have ethnographic notes like those on the right, or some collections might also have images or videos like those in the lower left-hand corner. More than likely, you'll end up opening up interview transcripts like the one that's seen here. You should have clear turn taking in speaker tags so you know who's talking. And there's just a lot of different types of data available. So have a good look through that collection first and see what's actually in there. The next thing you need to do is to orient yourself to the project. And I think the main point to make here is to not underestimate the amount of time that it would take to get acquainted with the data set. There might be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand the data. And what I mean by that is you need more than just the data collected at the time of the interview or whatever the data collection is, but you might also need to consider basic social characteristics of the participant or the historical time period in which the data was collected, or perhaps where the data was collected. So the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to really get at the root of what it can convey. Every collection that is archived at the UK Data Service will hold some documentation, which is a really useful starting point for doing this. And that might contain information about the methodology, such as an interview schedule or a call for participants, or sometimes it includes segments from publications that were arising from the original study, or it might even have something like funding applications. For qualitative data sets, this documentation is called the user guide, or the U guide. And here's an example of a user guide. This one happens to have an interview guide for interviewers. But there's also a consent form, a sample profile, and so on. It's just further background information to help you understand how the data was collected. But what if you want to know more about the participants themselves? Every qualitative study also has what's called a data listing, or a U list. And here's an example of one of these. And it's a table that gives a brief overview of the data in the collection. So each row represents a piece of data or a participant, and each column lists some kind of characteristic or attribute of that interview. So it's a quick way of getting to know who took part in the study, basically. In addition to the context of the data, you may also need to consider the sample. So for example, if the data set is too large, you may need to take a subsample. Qualitative collections tend to be smaller anyways, but many of the archived data sets are funded and they can collect a considerable amount of data. For a small dissertation project, you'll want to be realistic and decide if you need to limit the number of participants to a smaller subsample of those, of those that took part within the larger collection. So for example, the Edwardians collection, which was put together by Paul Thompson, and it's largely considered to be the first oral history of Britain, contains 453 80-plus page interviews. It's a huge collection. Conversely, most dissertation projects probably have an expectation of, 6 to 10 interviews. So you'd want a clear sampling strategy to help you choose which of those interviews you want to look at. Or you might be interested in a particular subgroup of the population. So again, you'd want to think about what criteria you're looking for. You might also want to combine different data collections that complement each other. And remember, it takes time to sift through and find the pieces of different data sets to pull together, but it's another possibility. If you feel that all of the data speaks to the same topic and research question, and you've done the work of recontextualizing to ensure that the interviews work together, then there's no reason why you can't combine some of those and create your own custom data set. So that is it for qualitative. I'm going to pass over to Ali now, so just bear with me for a moment while we
Yep, thanks Maureen. I'm just going to switch screens. Okay, perfect. You should all be able to see that. So thanks Maureen. As Maureen said, I'm going to give a quick rundown of the key methodological things you need to consider if you are using quantitative secondary analysis or are doing a quantitative reuse project. So I'm going to cover two main areas. First, the things you need to think about when you're selecting your data. And secondly, the things you might need to think about when you're understanding or getting to know your data. So the first section is on selecting your data. So some of you might already know which topic area that you want to look at or explore for your dissertation. But if not, I'm just going to give you a brief idea of some of the data available. So the UK Data Service holds quantitative data on a variety of topics. And if you attended Jen's webinar yesterday, you might know a little bit more about them. But just to give you an idea now, there's quantitative data available that could allow you to look at the environment, workforce patterns, healthcare, family spending, attitudes to the police and criminal justice system, time use during the pandemic, attitudes, and political opinions. And these are just a few examples. There are many, many more topics covered. So once you have a general idea of your topic area, you can think about the data you might use to explore it. And the key thing for a quantitative reuse project is to understand what you are trying to measure. So think about your topical questions, think about your key concepts, and importantly, think about how these relate to the variables within a data set. So for example, let's say we were interested in looking at the relationship between fear of crime and age. So we need to find some data that has variables that measure these concepts, so our key concepts, fear of crime and age, that will allow us to formulate and/or answer a research question about them. Now, as Maureen said earlier, it may not be possible to find the perfect data set, and you could spend a lot of time searching. So instead, you could start from data on a general topic and derive your key concepts and questions from the existing variables once you've gotten to know the data. If you do have a question in mind already, that's fine too, but you may just have to be flexible and revise it based on the data and the variables that are available. So if you're looking for data on a particular key topic, there's a few key places you can start. So you can use the theme pages on the UK Data Service website to look for key data sets on a particular theme. You can type keywords you're interested in into the data catalogue, or you might want to search the variable and question bank for variables on a particular topic. But please be aware that this hasn't been updated for a little bit, so it might not encapsulate all the current variables. You could also search HASIT, which is the Social Sciences Thesaurus, which lets you search data sets by key concepts. And the link to all of these can be found on the Find Data section of the website, and we will have a little practice of this in the practical as well. So once you have found a data set that you think might be suitable, you need to consult the catalogue page. And this will give you an overview of the key topics, background, and a brief overview of the methodology. And you can also access the documentation from here, including any user guides, technical reports, lists of the variables, and any notes added by the data producers to highlight any changes, reweighting, or editing to variables that might have been made since the data was first deposited. And as Maureen said, the documentation is really important. Importantly, the list of variables can also usually be found, can be found in the documentation, and this is usually in the user guide, the variable list, or the code book or data dictionary, and this might vary between data sets. And here you can find important information on what the variables measure, which is how you will help relate them to your key concepts. So back to our example that we were looking at earlier, we might choose to look at the crime survey for England and Wales. It's a large, important crime survey, and it's a source of information about crime that is independent from police records. It is an example of a repeated cross-sectional survey. Don't worry if you don't recognise all these terms, we'll go into them a bit more in a bit. It's a survey that's conducted every year, and it has a large sample size of 35,000 individuals aged 16 plus and 3,000 aged 10 to 15. So from having a look in the documentation, I can see that the crime survey for England and Wales has two variables which fit our key concepts. So the first of these is qual-life, which is how much is your own quality of life affected by fear of crime on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is no effect and 10 is a total effect on your quality of life. And the next is age, the respondent's age. So once you've found your variables, and it might take you a while looking through the documentation, looking through the different information to find the ones that are relevant, the important step is to think critically about what they measure. And this is particularly important for reuse projects because you're not asking the questions yourselves. So you really need to think about what your variables measure. So for example, this qual-life one, does it really measure fear of crime, or does it perhaps instead measure how much fear of crime affects life? So you need to think about what the question is really asking. And to understand this, you can look at the original questionnaire, which can usually be found in the documentation. So as well as considering your variables and your concepts, you also might want to consider the kind of analysis that you want to do or that you can do with the data. So for example, if you were interested in looking at individuals in a particular time point, you might want to use a cross-sectional survey. If you want to look at data across multiple points in time, you might want to use a repeated cross-sectional survey. So that's like the crime survey that we were looking at. If you are interested in data over a long period of time, you might look at longitudinal data. If you're interested in small geographic areas, you could use the census aggregate data or flow data. And if you want to compare countries over time, you can use international time series data. And you can search by all these different data types on the UK Data Service website. So as well as this, it's also important to think about your population. So that's the group you want to measure. So for example, this might be the population of the world, the UK, or perhaps you want to ask questions about a particular city or local authority area. And as well as this, you need to consider your unit of analysis. Are you interested in individual people, or are you interested in whole households? And this will affect the data you use and the kind of analysis you can do and the questions you can ask, as some data sets are only available for particular geographies or for certain units. So finally, it's important to remember that the process isn't linear. You may need to go back and forth and realign your question with the available data. You might need to compromise if the perfect data set isn't available, or choose different variables and refine your question. And this is all part, as Maureen said earlier, of doing secondary or analysis or a reuse project. So once you've chosen your data set, there are a few final things you need to consider. So as we said, the documentation usually contains information on the variables, but it should also have information on the questionnaire used to collect the data. And to understand your variables, it's really important to understand the questionnaire. And something that's really particularly important is the routing, and that's who was asked which questions. And this is because many questionnaires use something called computer-aided interviewing, which sends respondents through the questionnaire by different routes depending on their previous answers. So therefore, many questions in a survey may only be applicable to some of the sample. So it's always a good idea to check the documentation to see who was asked about the variables that you're interested in. So for example, this is a variable called flex10 from the labour force survey, which relates to special working arrangements. In this catalogue, in this documentation entry, you can see the exact wording of the question, as well as a range of answers and how they're coded. And importantly, underneath this, we can see that the question was asked if a respondent is in work, and it also gives information on the variables used to identify who was in work. And you'll find that the documentation looks a bit different across different data sets, but this gives you a general idea of the kind of thing to expect. As well as this, you can also find information about how the data was processed after collection. So important thing to consider are the derived variables, and these are variables created from the raw data. The derived variable. So this shows how the flex10 variables, which we talked about on the last slide, have been used to derive a new variable called flexw7. So those who responded 7 on the flex10 variable, indicating they had a 0 hours contract, are now coded as 1 on the new flexw7 variable, and therefore it's a new variable which measures whether someone has a 0 hours contract or not. Now don't worry if this looks a bit complicated, it can take a while to get your head around the documentation, but if you are using a derived variable, it's really important you understand this. And just to say that not all documentation contains these diagrams. In some surveys, it might just be the SPSS or stata syntax, which show you how the variable's been derived. But although it looks complicated, if you take a bit of time, you should be able to get your head around it and understand where the derived variables have come from. The final thing you need to think about, as with qualitative analysis, is sampling. So surveys and similar quantitative data sources are almost always based on samples. And one important question you need to ask is your sample representative? So you need to know who is included in the sample. Is it adults? Is it only those who live in private addresses? Is it only those who attend school? what was the response rate, and is there any information about different response across the population? And this will tell you potential bias. And you also need to know, do you need to apply a weight to make the data representative? And you'll once again find all this information in the documentation that comes along with the data, so in the user guides and the technical reports. Finally, you need to think about whether you have enough cases to make a precise estimate. So for example, the crime survey for England and Wales, which we looked at, had a very large sample size, which should allow you to make precise estimates. However, with smaller samples and analysis of smaller subpopulations, so for example, say you're cutting your data set down to study only a particular group of people, you might not have enough cases in your sample to make precise estimates. Now, I've just given a very brief overview of sampling considerations, and there are more resources available on the UK Data Service website. So we have a guide on survey weights and complex sampling, so do look those up when you come to that part of your dissertation to help you understand those more. So finally, just to summarise, for quantitative projects, you need to think about your key concepts, what you're trying to measure, and how these relate to the variables in a data. It's important that you check the catalogue and the documentation to help you understand your data and the variables and where they came from, and you need to consider issues to do with sampling. Okay, so Maureen, did you just want to talk through some of these additional resources?
Yeah, so hopefully, you've got some inspiration now for a project you could do. And, this workshop is really just a quick overview, and I know there's a lot of information being thrown at you. So we just wanted to give you some further resources which will help you navigate your way through a reuse project. So there's a few publications out which would be useful. If you're doing quantitative work, then Emma Smith's book, Using Secondary Data in Educational and Social Research, might be useful. There's also a chapter in SAGE's Handbook of Social Research Methods on secondary analysis of quantitative data sources. And we also have some data skills modules, which will help guide you through, steps of statistical analysis. For qualitative projects, there's a chapter in Silverman's Qualitative Research textbook on secondary analysis, and there's also a working paper series available through the Timescapes archive. Karen Hughes and Aaron Tarrant have also recently published a handbook of qualitative secondary analysis. And finally, if you need more help with finding, accessing, or downloading data, we have video tutorials which will walk you through the process with step-by-step procedures.